We facilitate conversations about and promote the values of freedom, humanism, and universalism. And this is part 2 of the Equiano Project series, Alternative Possibilities. And this episode is called Humanism, Universalism, and the Case for Utopian Ideals. So we are joined by Ralph Leonard, who is a writer and describes himself in his Twitter bio, I'll say, as a secular humanist, libertine, and a conservative Marxist. He regularly writes for Unheard and Ario on issues of international politics, religion, culture, and humanism. And the reason we are having this discussion today is because obviously many people, when it comes to particularly issues of race and anti-racism, often think that there is just one perspective and one way of responding to those issues, and that is often through a very particular identitarian lens. And actually the kind of universalist framework or even the liberal tradition of anti-racism often gets drowned out in the noise. So this is part of a series exploring alternative possibilities. So thank you so much for joining me, Ralph.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I guess the first question that I wanted to ask you is, how would you describe yourself philosophically, ideologically, and how did you get to the position that you are in terms of the way that you think?
I suppose philosophically, I suppose you could say I am a humanist just in a very basic sense, in the sense that I believe that human beings are the subjects of, not its object, and that human beings have a unique position within the natural world as opposed to other animals. Our capacity for rationality and our unique sense of sociability, so that we have a way of sort of acting upon the world and changing the course of history itself. And so in that sense, I'm a humanist. As for politically speaking and ideologically, I suppose, like my bio sort of says, that I am a Marxist of a sort, that I do believe in materialist conception of history and the dialectic and everything like that. And as to how I've gotten to this position, I suppose I'm in the sense I think I'm at the start of my ideological and philosophical journey. And I suppose before I used to be a much more sort of strident Trotskyist of a sort, and sort of more recent sort of become much more I suppose a more independent kind of Marxist in a way. So yeah, that's how I would describe myself.
So what drew you to Marxism? And I think you obviously described about the kind of materialist conception of history and the dialectic, but when, particularly in popular culture, one would say, when we hear about Marxism, it often has a lot of negative connotations. I mean, I think even Black Lives Matter, for example, describe themselves as a Marxist organization. And so it'd be interesting to hear what you think about that, the popular conception of Marxism versus yours, and how you what led you to kind of take that particular route.
First of all, I think it's weird because there's always this saying about political philosophy that it all comes down to your view of human nature, and I thought I suppose find the Hegelian Marxist view of human nature more quite convincing. And I mean, Marx doesn't actually use the word human nature, it's species being he uses. And it's very different to, say, the liberal conception of human nature, which had this sort of eternal, very static quality, that it's been the same as it has always been. Whereas I find the sort of species being a very much more dynamic and plural human nature, that it it develops out of mankind's interaction with history, the historical process, then it is the evolution of social and historical development. And there's this, if you like, dialectical interplay between subjectivity and object, the human being and his interaction with the world. And through that, his essence, the essence of humanity comes out. That, first of all, to me, is what was convincing about it. Secondly, I see Marxism, or you know, specifically the Marxist vision of socialism, as, if you like, the scion of the of first of all the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution. The the three, I think, uh, sort of ideas that have shaped the modern world, and I think it is the completion of mankind's search for freedom. If, in essence, that's why I'm a Marxist, because I believe in human freedom, and I know for some people that contradiction. They what they see with Marxism is, as in, the Mao's sort of insane cultural revolution, and I but I would say that there's always been an alternative, anti-totalitarian vision of Marxism and socialism that has been more concerned with freedom and humanism.
So why do you think? I mean, you touched upon it. I guess in terms of Mao, and I guess you might argue to be the totalitarianism during the 20th century. Do you point that as the way in which Marxism as a philosophy has largely been tarnished, in terms of popular conception of it?
Yeah, I think that that's saying the obvious. That's the reason why Marxism is ultimately, like, as of now, it's basically a dead force. It's
Mm.
not in any real sense a living popular uh, ideology has a that is an actor in the political scene. And unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that Marxism did this to itself. It committed suicide because, unfortunately, a lot of radicals and leftists and Marxists were fellow travelers with the Soviet Union and all the other sort of failed uh, experiments in communism, which were, incredibly oppressive.
Mm. So what do you think, is the problem with the left at the moment then? If you have a conception of Marx that is, humanistic and one that values freedom, why has that not seemed to necessarily gain traction, in regards to, popular left-wing policies? If they're not necessarily disillusioned with Marx, but they're not necessarily convinced, in terms of momentum with regards to your conception of it.
Um, and I think, well, I think that the left has, inhaled a lot of, in my opinion, reactionary, backward, and anti-aggressive ideals that, in my view, have absolutely nothing to do with Marxism, socialism, or even any kind of progressive ideology. Like, obviously, there's identity politics. Uh, there is this sort of misanthropy, that that you know that is sort of against the idea of human agents, like human collective agency acting upon the natural world, that man can uh, use nature for his own benefit, and that's where you have this sense around extinction rebellion or degrowth and all the rest of it. So that in essence is what's wrong with the left. That uh, it's become reactionary,
Mm. Mm.
not progressive.
So why do you think identity politics, as you've written about it before, why do you think identity politics is so appealing and attractive to many people on the left at the moment?
Well, first of all, I think it's because that the universalist sort of point of view has uh, gone by the wayside, partially because of the failed, partially because of the Soviet Union and that 20th century communism becoming incredibly oppressive. And also, I think it's a reason I also think why identity is on vogue is I think people are trying to have almost a sort of groping for a sort of collective communal identity because old relational community identity has withered away because of the liquidification of capitalism and dramatic changes in family, religion, secularization of society, community structures and affiliations withering. And I think this search for identity and identity politics is not just the sort of replacement for old radical politics. It's also a search for a new kind of rooted community identity in place of atomization.
Mm. That's really interesting. I mean, but do you think identity can fill that for a lot of people, because it is very attractive and it seems to be growing and gaining much more momentum? Do you think that identity is a hollow form of kind of solidarity or community, or do you think it is something that can potentially uh, fill that for some?
Well, it depends because this version of I, yeah, this this version of identity that we're currently seeing, I think, is a very hollow one. It's almost this sort of off the shelf uh, counterfeit for like previous um, for previous relational community identities. Like, and it is the use of the phrase "I identify as." When like people usually, if you ask them what they are, they'll say, "I am a Catholic," for example, or "I am a father," or "I am a husband." Imagine someone saying, "I identify as a father." That would be completely ridiculous. Uh, but you see people saying, "I identify as this," or "I identify as that," within this very narrow culture, and I think that's why I think it's very hollow.
Mm. So when you talk about obviously following on from this conversation about identity, you obviously support a universalist conception of society. How would you describe universalism to people, and how would you, especially in contrast to identity politics?
Universalism, but let's like try and because you'll find universalism in essence is like something a principle that could apply to everyone. So one antecedent of universalism is Christianity and Islam, universalist religions who believe that the entry to the community of believers is applicable to all, irrespective of like tribe, ethnicity, or nation, or king, wherever you. And then you have Enlightenment humanism, which is an outgrowth of Renaissance humanism that posits a sort of common human race, but is a very secular interpretation without this religious mystification. And again, then you have liberal universalism. Liberal universalism, like I said before, is based on a common human nature that with a static, eternal quality that applies to all people, irrespective of nation, class, and then the Marxist universalism, again based on species being with history, and that is how his is evolved. Um, so, and you know, in my opinion, that a universalist politics is what is required for any kind of progressive uh, vision, because in essence, uh, it's about the freedom of humanity, the emancipation of humanity and oppressed people.
Mm. So like in you wrote an article in Unheard, describing racial categories as reactionary. Do you see essentially racialization or just racial categories in and of itself as a challenge for universalist ideals, or do you think that we can have a kind of racialization within that dynamic as well?
No, no, I do think racial categories are, reactionary, because the thing about racism is that it, put it simply, about the dividing the human species into different so-called races, and then ascribing them with essential eternal qualities that I think is it's anti-human and anti-universalist, because you're putting human beings, which are very complicated and dynamic creatures with all sorts of pluralistic and dynamic qualities, into rigid boxes that you are this and that's what you are.
Mm.
And it also produces this deterministic way of thinking, that because you are black or white, you are this or that.
Mm.
Finish by saying that racism also has this sort of mystical quality, by that it's like tries to exist outside of history and the material world itself. That it's like, it's, to me, it's a superstition. It's like a mob superstition, like magic or spirits, that I think uh, should be done away with.
That's very interesting. So where do you think um, this kind of entrenchment of racial categorization is coming from mainly now? I mean, would you say that it is still coming from the more traditional racism from the top down, or do you think there are other elements that are leading to the reification of race in the present day?
Um, yeah, I think that the traditional racism is still there, and then also have this sort of far right movement, which again, interesting, sort of borrows of this sort of identity talk. So you see with like the alt right, they talk about white identity, white culture, and all this stuff. But I think also there, on the other side, there's also not, I wouldn't say left racism, but a left racialism, which is, it's not racism in the sense of how we traditionally understand. It's still racial in that it is people, and and again does this sort of game, sort of ascribing essential qualities to race, like this discourse around whiteness. And like, to give you a quick example, like in the past few days there's been this little controversy over Beethoven, like on Vox. um, so basically Vox published a podcast on Beethoven and the legacy of Beethoven, and which is mainly of the elitism within classical music. It's a legitimate point. In the synopsis, talked about Bitsony was what interpreted Beethoven's role with his deafness and his resilience. But it seemed to be saying that, well, that's only an interpretation wealthy white people could have. But then if people of color or gay people or women listen to it, they'll all of a sudden feel excluded or uh, discriminated against, or they feel distressed. And to me, that's odd and an odd view to have, because it's I don't see how Beethoven's music somehow in and of itself is only for white people. It's just as applicable to black people as anybody else. So that's one small example of this left racialism or progressive racism on those itself.
No, I very much agree. But yes, no, that's very interesting. What you're saying about, you know, essentially left racialism, but I guess a lot of black people, for example, they take a lot of pride in their racial identity, or you know, they feel that you know, they need to affirm it or assert their racial identity. How do you think that we need to be calling that out and combating that as well? Or yeah, what do you think we need to do about that reality, that race for people that were historically subjugated now is a source of kind of pride, essentially?
Good question. I mean, I would say it does that kind of racial essentialism that, you know, because you all find this idea that to be black must be like this, and if you're not really black, and that's obviously very, very ridiculous. And, yeah, I do think that has to be challenged, but also you have to be a little bit slightly sensitive to it, because that kind of like search it's a search for identity, so to root yourself in a kind of solid ground that gives you sort of personal meaning. And again, it's a response to, you know, real historical and life racial oppression. Ultimately, I think the argument has made that this game of race has to be transcended, because it is anti-human and it's a threat upon human potential.
So how do we transcend these things? It feels, yeah, it feels so deep rooted. In some ways, it's kind of a conversation that feels yeah, utopian in nature is what we can aspire to and hope. But it, you know, this whole movement of racialization and essentialization is now taking so much momentum. Where do you think we go if we want to start to unpack this deep-seated thinking at the moment?
That's a very hard question. The $1 million question. How do you abolish racism? How do you end race? Um, I would say, first of all, I do one way you could start to go that direction is to, I suppose, reinvigorate sort of universalism and humanistic idea within social movements against like inequality or racial oppression or racial coordination, which does exist, but the movements that are currently existing, in my opinion, have this use this reactionary identity politics. I don't think it's helpful, and I don't think will bring about freedom and racialized people. So Yeah, unfortunately, I can't really give you a good answer to that, but because it's a very, very hard question, and you know, some Marx will obviously say, well, you have to abolish capitalism. It's that simple because abolishing capitalism is very difficult and world history tasks. So yeah, the, it's a hard question.
Mm.
That's the answer.
So what do you think about British society? I mean, a lot of the people that make these other arguments that you're critiquing believe that Britain is essentially a fundamentally racist society, and they would argue that really things haven't changed. I mean, one of the phrases we hear is racism is just as bad, but perhaps it's gone underground. That's what we hear. Do you think that's true? Do you think there has been progress? What do you think of Britain today?
Um, yeah, I think it's obvious that there has been progress. I think if to say that obviously say that racism hasn't changed, that's just patently untrue because I think for the past 40, 40 years, there has been, I think, a sort of dramatic realization within culture, not just like in regards to race, but in terms of sexual, uh, um, even the decline of deference, and all these other things and um, that has that has like um, like declined laws and institutional practice that have sort of now they're no longer there. So I think there has been progress, and as for is Britain fundamentally racist, yeah, I think that's sort of the wrong question to ask. Like the question asked would be, that is racism in Britain? I think most will agree, yes, there is. Does that mean Britain is essentially a racist society with a capital R? No, I don't think so. So I do think that with these sort of questions, we're always sort of asking wrong questions, and often the way we ask those questions means that the the discussion that goes on afterwards always leads down to blind answers, and that's I think a lot of problem with a lot of the discussions around race in Britain and in America today, that we always ask the wrong questions.
So do you think, I mean, a lot of the discussion as well, is around colonialism and its legacy. Do you think that Britain hasn't, what people usually say is reconciled with the legacy of colonialism? What do you think about that?
Um, depends who you're talking about with who's Britain. It depends who you're asking. Uh,
Mm.
I think I do think that there is a sort of a general ignorance about the British Empire beyond like obvious stuff that like you people will know, but I don't think they know about the history. They don't quite. There's a sort of ignorance about the history of the British Empire and what its relationship with the colonies that I do think more people should know about. And I suppose you can call that the failure to reconcile the legacy of colonialism. And look, some people make this point in a very tendency way that you know they want to have a very particular view that they want to imprint upon people. And I do think, I do think that in the process of education, do you think that people should learn about the British Empire and the multi-sided view of that relationship with colony. Um, in some aspects, I think there's this, you call it imperial guilt from sort of some liberals, which I think they really overcompensating, and I do think it's a little embarrassing, and it doesn't actually enlighten anybody. It's the sort of narcissistic virtue signaling, in my view.
So yeah, so you think that obviously Britain would benefit from learning more about the legacy of empire, or at least its relationship with the colonies. But do you think that, because I think the argument a lot of the time, particularly with the decolonizer curriculum movement, is that ethnic minorities in particular, it will help them to see themselves in British society, or that they should see themselves reflected. Do you buy those arguments that it would help people feel a stronger sense of belonging if they really understood the truth, so to speak, about how the British Empire was?
Well, that's a very odd argument. That um, would it give people a better sense of belonging? And make for some people, but I, I I don't really think that should be the purpose of like education, is to see yourself reflected in history. Because first, well, I think part of education is actually kind of the opposite. It's try is to sort of interact with people who are much different to you, who are uh, who hold views that you don't agree with, that have done things you don't agree with, and to try and enlighten yourself as to those different sorts of views, and sort of cultivate your own sense of independent thought. So I don't, I really don't think that this argument over decolonizing the curriculum or the teaching of colonialism, I think people have to be very careful not to use this in a very tendentious way, because often of the time there's a very, like, they're trying to it's like imprint their own sort of propaganda onto other people, and it's not actually in the sort of education in any real sense. It's like a lot of it is like the reverse, the old imperial education, which is again its own form of propaganda, which also left a lot of the British Empire out, a lot of the bad things that the British Empire did, and of course, like its racial ideology.
So speaking of, I guess, history and important historical figures and the kind of decolonial movements that were happening, you've written a lot about CLR James and how, I guess, he's inspired you, his ideas and his thinking. For people watching, could you tell us about who he is and the ideas that he advocated for or argued for that really inspired you, and why that was?
Okay, yeah, well, CLR James was a Stadian Marxist, Trotskyist, who was, and I even wrote in my article that he was like one of the few people you could say was anti-colonialist, anti-fascist, and anti-Stalinist all at the same time. He's one of the few people you could ever say that about. What were his ideas? The idea that he influenced me was, first of all, his radical universal humanism. That his idea that every human being has the capacity within himself to change the course of destiny, and that again comes from his revolutionary politics, because he was an orthodox Marxist, and he believed that the proletariat has it to change history, overthrow capitalist society and then usher in a new socialistic communist system that is more democratic, that really would be democratic. Again, his view on democracy, like he was a very purist in terms of democracy. Every cook can govern is a phrase associated with, actually comes from Leonard, but yeah, again, it's about the idea that every person has the capacity to rule, to shape the act of government. Um, and as well, his his book on the Haitian Revolution, the Black Jacobins, also heavily influenced me because it tells the story of, but in my opinion, one of the greatest events in human history, how slaves started a revolution, overthrew their masters, and became the government themselves. And as well, also more inspiring is how the ideals of that from the Enlightenment and Revolution, it's the same, it's the same thing. So as well, it's a good posit to this idea that Enlightenment ideals are, oh, it's only white men and their oppressive black people. Nonsense.
So, I mean, I'm very much inspired by many of the things that you've just outlined. Then, I guess for a lot of people, how do you cultivate that? How do you cultivate that? Individually, this sense of agency, essentially, that each human being has, the capacities to transform themselves and the world around them. Yeah, why is there a stronger kind of anti-humanist sense? That is pervasive in society versus this very almost inspiring sense of the capacity of human beings. How do we cultivate that sentiment?
I suppose because how do you cultivate that sentiment? I think one is, I think it's a simple answer. I think knowledge, more like educate, like even self-education. I think it's a very individualist point, but there's some good to it because I always think about Frederick Douglass. He was a slave who learned how to read, and then that his inquisitive mind meant he uh, developed his own capacity as a human being to think about freedom and think about his own agency and autonomy. And from there, he he couldn't be the same person. He couldn't think like a slave anymore. He couldn't be controlled by the whip. The whip can't touch his mind, and so that's a bit, that's inspiration to me, as well. How, one thing you have to understand is why there is this anti-humanism that's quite pervasive is, I think, that pessimism about the ideal of social change, social transformation, the idea that human beings can uh, shape a better destiny for themselves because, again, because of, one of them is the failure of communism. That's one reason, and the failure of liberalism, because after the post-war period, there was this idea that, the Enlightenment and rationalization for the horror of the 20th century, both, the Holocaust and Stalin's Gulag, and because of that, the Enlightenment had to be done away with. And I think, yeah, that's why.
So I guess, obviously you've talked about, the failure in the 20th century for a lot of people, like a kind of disillusionment and a pessimism towards the inability to realize change in a more significant way. So do you have criticisms of liberalism as well then? Because I think a lot of people, for example, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, who are gaining prominence, that their response to what is going on is a kind of liberal universalism. You've kind of said that, you've alluded that you have criticisms of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first of all, as I sort of mentioned, the difference in human nature between liberalism and Marxism, that obviously liberalism, I think, has a very static view of human nature, which is undynamic. On the other hand, also another criticism of liberalism is that its ideals or its sentiment of human freedom simply cannot be realized in the current state of relation. Right? Capitalism simply can't realize it, which is because liberalism once was a revolutionary force against feudalism, against aristocracy, and the ideal of the liberal individual. Liberal individualism is very limited against those previous forms of social relations. But with the advent of industrial society, liberalism becomes oppressive, um, and especially and liberals themselves became reactionary. So when like the working class all of a sudden want the same ideals of liberty, fraternity, equality, then the liberals are happy with it because it's a threat to their own class rule. Hence, in 1848, what happened there? Uh, and it also seemed to me that uh, liberalism now is not in a good place because in response to all the current economic crisis, social decay, it just can't think up an answer, a response to it. So it then you get to this position where liberalism starts to undermine itself. And I think that's a bad thing because ultimately what the good things about liberalism then disappear.
When you say liberalism starts to undermine itself, could you elaborate a little bit?
So, like I said, I'm trying. Let me trying to construct an answer to this. Well, because liberalism is the ideology of modern capitalist society,
Mm-hmm.
and you get into this position where the economic system, that's really the point about this, it becomes oppressive toward the individual. Because if you have the individual worker, the proletariat, who has to work under degrading conditions just to his whole existence is subordinated to fluctuating market forces that could deprive him at any moment, as we are seeing now with the coronavirus. And then his desire for self-actualization diminish.
Very interesting. I guess a final question for the last few minutes. Yeah, it alludes to what I asked you earlier in terms of, how do we go beyond this moment? If you are, what advice would you give to someone that is deeply idealistic, got a lot of energy, but is, I guess, steeped right now in the very kind of woke identity politics thinking, and feels like that's the answer? Yeah, what kind of advice would you give in terms of meeting the desire for idealism and rebellion in a way, but something perhaps more profound and meaningful?
What advice would I give? That's a good question. I suppose my advice would be that you're not. I have to think about one.
That's fine.
Because not often people ask me for advice on this sort of thing. Would, read Goethe. No. Uh, I would say actually this is what I would say. If you haven't already, read Black Jacobin, and there you'll find the perfect synthesis of your want for idealism and fighting oppression attached to this humanistic and universal politics that you think is actually oppressive and racist. And you'll find perfect synthesis that there is an Enlightenment universal politics that is in time best tool you can have to fight against racism that you want to fight.
Well, that's
Start there.
well, that's great. No, I think that's very good advice. And yeah, so I guess we've come to the end of the hour. Very interesting to hear your perspective, in terms of humanism and universalism, and the potential to realize a different society with much more, socially and politically and intellectually conscious beings, and cultivating that capacity. So I think that's very inspiring, and thank you very much for joining me this evening.